conservancy. The library and I worked together and had a nice little coming together of the community to learn a little bit about native seed collection. And as we were talking about that, invasives came up, and there seemed to be a little bit of an interest. So my background is in invasive species. I've worked on some management crews, a few around the East Coast and a few that were in New York. And I initially sort of got into that because I was working in landscaping and gardening and wanted to learn all the plants there. And it turned out that a lot of landscaping plants ended up being invasive later, and a lot of invasives came from horticulture. So turned me into a big advocate for eco-conscious gardening and native gardening and invasives management, because I think a lot of green thumbs would be interested in getting on the same page about the importance of that. So that's why I like to get in touch with landowners and gardeners about this sort of stuff. So that's what we're going to be going over tonight. So some of you guys might know a little bit about invasives already, but in case you don't, the thing that makes an invasive is that it outcompetes native species. So anything that you see, we have spring coming up, we're going to see vines overtaking trees and shrubs just sort of filling in a forest. That's because something has left its native range where it had predators and pests and diseases that would keep its populations in check, and come to somewhere where their population is no longer in check. So they can reproduce and spread. And when things are really invasive, it's because their natural behavior is to reproduce really rapidly and disperse really far. And they can tolerate a range of conditions. So an invasive typically doesn't care if it's hot or cold or dry or wet or sunny or shady, like a lot of native plants do. And if you're a gardener, then you know that plants can be really picky, but invasives are not. And for that reason, they can really thrive in disturbance areas. So it doesn't matter if it's a parking lot or a dam or a housing development, they don't mind and they can still pop up. But the kicker with invasives is that even if a plant or a pest has all of these qualities, it might not necessarily be invasive unless it's been introduced by humans. So the classic example that I go to is poison ivy. In New York State, poison ivy is a native plant. A lot of bird species and other wildlife depend on it, but we don't really like it. So we call it a nuisance species because it does get in our way and it does have a lot of that aggressive growing habit. But it's not technically invasive because it was here all along. So my other go-to analogy for how humans can play a part in how invasives get here is showing people these places. So if you're into plants or like being outdoors at all, these probably look like spots that you might want to be. That's the Royal Gardens at Kew in the UK, the Arnold Arboretum, both awesome botanical gardens. The World's Fair, which was way back in the day, but now we have a lot of garden shows and horticultural shows that are pretty comparable. And in the US, we have a ton of estates and different fancy properties where gardens play a big role, and that's where a lot of horticultural professionals often get their start. So the reason that I bring these up, because I'm going to bring up some pictures behind the text here of other things that you might recognize. So these are a bunch of invasive plants. And the reason that I bring up those sort of cultural staples of horticulture is because these were actually all the introduction routes for these plants to leave their native range and become invasives. So the Royal Gardens at Kew were the first ones to repot and bring over giant hogweed. Harvard had water chestnut on their aquatic exhibit at their botanical garden hundreds of or decades ago. It was in like the late 1800s. A lot of this happened. Kudzu was brought over at the World's Fair, also in the 1800s, as a living fence and erosion control. And hemlock woolly adelgid can actually be traced back to the same garden designer that worked at numerous estates in the 1800s as well, bringing in plants. So this is just the example that I bring up, that historically, people had an opportunity to be mindful about what they were planting and to learn about the plants that they were working with. And it had consequences to not. So it's always just important to be mindful. So what are the species that we're going to be concerned about in our region that we might see in our own backyards or in our own communities? I'm going to talk a little bit about woody invasives and a little bit about ground cover. So we're going to be focusing more on sort of the forest areas and edge habitats around rural and suburbs. So these are going to be a lot of the ones that you'll see in New York State. So for woodies, it's pretty much anything that looks sort of like a shrubby, shaggy, small tree. They tend to look kind of straggly, and I'll show you pictures later. So some common ones are Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, honeysuckle, bittersweet, burning bush, privet, autumn olive, and common buckthorn. And a lot of these you'll see sort of resemble each other. You might recognize a lot of them. The reason they're a problem is because they form monocultures in the forest understory. They create brambles, which are just not fun to walk through. And they create really good habitats for things like ticks, but they don't support any wildlife beyond that. So they're not something you want to have. So barberry is a very recognizable one. This is sort of what I was talking about in the top left photo. You just see a bunch of straggly plants that all look alike. That's going to be common with a lot of them, but with barberry, you have these small ovate leaves that are almost whorled around the stem with these sort of long, shiny, bright red berries in the fall. And they have tiny, straight thorns that you'll definitely feel if you try to pull it. And if you do pull it, then you'll see that the roots are bright fluorescent yellow, which is definitely unique. And if you do decide to yank a bunch of these out, it's always important to make sure that the roots are either on a rock face or hanging from a tree or bagged in a garbage bag ready to go in the trash, because if they remain in contact with the ground, then they can reroot and just keep on growing. The other thing I wanted to point out about barberry is, even though they're on the prohibited list, a lot of people have planted these and occasionally they'll still be sold, especially cultivars that claim to be sterile. They'll often look like this, like that dark purple or some variation of red or that lime green in the background. Even though it's a different cultivar, it can still hybridize with barberry that's just off in the woods, and it's still invasive. So it's like putting lipstick on a pig. Honeysuckle is another one we love to hate. It looks like a shrub, so it's not super helpful unless it's flowering or fruiting. The flowers are these sort of asymmetrical, often like white to orange. They look like native honeysuckle, but native honeysuckle is much less common in a lot of developed areas at this point. And they have these conjoined red berries that are pretty unmistakable. And the thing about the berries that's interesting is that they're filled with water and the seeds. So that's really good for the plant because a bird will say, oh my gosh, that looks so delicious, and eat it as a snack, gorge itself on it for the whole day. And the plant gets spread really well because it's eaten a lot of seeds, but there's not really enough nutrients in there for wildlife. So it's really not good for birds. And it also grows in this sort of shaggy form. And if you're really unsure, then you can take your pruners and just give the stem a little snip, and the center of the stem will be hollow. So that's called the pith. And whereas native honeysuckle or other plants might have a different shade of woody material or pulp in there, they just have dead air. Bittersweet is another one that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. They have these serrated edges on the leaves, and the end of the leaf looks pinched usually, although there is a lot of variation in the leaves that I find. Super easy to tell when you have bittersweet in the fall, because you have the yellow bracts with the red berry sticking out. My mother still makes those Victorian era wreaths out of these, which of course, I hate because it's invasive. But that makes it really recognizable. And the other thing that's interesting about invasive vines in general, you'll see that bittersweet sort of tangles around itself as it grows, and it wraps around the tree. So if you have a native vine, it actually won't do that. It'll have little, I can't think of the word right now, almost like little suckers that tendrils is the word, that will stick to the tree and hang on to it as it grows along the tree instead of wrapping around and choking it out. So the next time you see like a poison ivy vine, like I said, how that's native, it'll have little tendrils that sort of stick onto the bark, but it won't mechanically wrap all the way around the tree. So that's how you can tell an invasive vine in general. And bittersweet has these little sort of pock marks on it as well as it matures. And if you cut it, the inside is orange and the roots are orange. So that's a good telltale sign as well. So some gardeners get upset with me when I tell them that burning bush is invasive, but it's not a good one. Even though it's on every street corner in every town at this point. It does have that beautiful fall color, bright red. So that's really easy to tell. But other times of year, it's very easy to recognize because it has these wings on the stem. So you see those like little rectangular bits sort of along the stem. And those are like these sort of paper thin, woody edges that you could just break right off. So that's very distinct for burning bush. And it has sort of similar berries to barberry. It just grows in this sort of like witch's broom upright format. Multiflora Rose, well, you'll know it if you walk into it because you'll be in pain. And that's because it has these backward arching sort of barbed thorns. So whereas other thorny plants like greenbrier might have just sort of like a thorn that just sticks straight out, Multiflora Rose barbs backwards. It has these little white flowers with 4 petals. But the other thing too is that it's sort of tough to tell if you have a native rose or a multiflora rose. Multiflora rose is so common that chances are it is a multiflora rose if you're in this area, in the suburbs or something. But the petiole on native versus invasive roses is different. That's the part that connects this area of the leaves to the stem. That petiole will be entire, is the botanical term, on a native rose, whereas you can see on the multiflora rose, it's fringed, so it almost looks like hairy or like cut into pieces. So if you look at this particular part of the plant near the stem, and you see that it's just sort of one full wing, then it's native. And I found a few of those, which is something to say because this is a really invasive plant and it forms really dense brambles as well. I'm going to sort of go through all of these at once because they really resemble each other. Autumn olive has these really, I mean, they're large, but you almost don't see them when you're walking up to the plant. Large sort of woody thorns, and it has these dark sort of navy blue berries. But the really interesting thing about autumn olive, I almost don't blame the person that brought autumn olive over, is because it shimmers. It's almost glittery. The underside of the leaves is this light glittery color, and then if you look really close at the front of the leaf as well, it shimmers a little bit too. But this is really noticeably glittery, not something you see in nature. So that's autumn olive. Buckthorn has a really similar growing habit, but it has these little white almost dots along the bark, especially when it's younger. And it has leaf veins that sort of bend not all the way back in like a dogwood, but out to the edge like that. So you'll see the leaf veins sort of bend that way. And privet has these opposite leaves and really similar to autumn olive, dark bluish berries in these bunches, and it'll have thorns that are pretty similar too. And all of them have sort of shiny gray bark. So when it comes to things like that, I just sort of tell people if it looks invasive, it probably is. So I show these pictures as well because a lot of people don't necessarily think about the fact that temperate forests like we have in New York are similar to rainforests that are supposed to have sort of a ground cover and then an understory and then a lower canopy and an upper canopy. That's something that should be shared by most forests, whereas in this area, especially in really invaded areas, you have a canopy and almost no understory. And if you do, it's a lot of invasives. So that's another big problem with it. You can see that this is all barberry. So that's one plant, and there's no opportunity for wildlife to take advantage of any other species. So if you see a sea of green, it's probably not a good sign. Speaking of sea of green, I like to bring up ground cover, just because in addition to that ironic name, like if it covers the entire ground, of course, there's going to be an issue, you know. These are all really popular for landscaping because they're quick and easy, and they're cheaper because they cover a lot of area. So English ivy is one, myrtle or vinca minor, winter creeper, yellow archangel, and pachysandra. I hope I didn't just break anybody's hearts by telling you that those are invasive, because these were, before I knew that I was a teenager, these were like some of my favorite garden plants. But those spread out super easily, and nothing eats them. So they're all invasive. So for management of all these plants, it sort of varies on the size of the infestation, what sort of resources and materials you have to work with, how long it's been there, what kind of environment it's in, and what it is. So with a lot of those ground cover species, like archangel is a great example of something you could just pull out. I mean, if you have a lot of it, then it might take you a little while, but you can just yank it all out and put it in a bag and not think about it again. But with trees and things like that, then it might take a little more doing. So girdling for invasive trees, like this picture very dramatically shows, can be an option. Obviously cutting. I had to include a picture of the weed wrench, my favorite tool, that has this nice little pulley system, so you can put your undesirable plant in the little jaws there and then pull back on that lever. Those are pretty cool. They're not great for everything though, they have their limitations. But cutting, I think for the majority of sort of those really common woody plants, if you just keep cutting and keep cutting, that can really make a dent. It might not get rid of them completely, but it'll definitely suppress them. As far as chemical methods, if you want to take that regular cutting a step further, then treating the stump in something we call a cut stump treatment can be really helpful. So that just means you put herbicide in what's called the cambium, which is the actively growing part of the woody plant. So that's just the ring on the outside. And that's all you have to add if it's a woody plant. So it's pretty cost effective and easy. But you do want to be really careful, obviously, with pesticides. The best time of year to do that is fall as well, because you can see, like in this picture, there's no real chance of overshooting because there's no other plants around, and that's when the plant is taking nutrients into the roots to sort of save them for spring. So the chemical will be really effective. And just to drive that point home that, you know, herbicide is not a force to be reckoned with. The thing that we're taught as pesticide technicians is that the label is the law. So if you buy a jug of Roundup and it has that little like booklet behind the sticker, then whoever's using that product is actually accountable to follow all of the different regulations specified within that label. So that includes wearing personal protective equipment, using proper quantities. So that'll be mixing and applying. You can only apply a certain amount per acre, things like that. You can't apply in aquatic areas, but you can use herbicide if you own the property. So that is a double-edged sword, because it's not legal to apply herbicide anywhere other than your own property unless you are a licensed technician or applicator. But it's a really effective method if it's not used super frequently. So I think it, in some cases we'll talk about as well, it can really be a lifesaver in terms of invasive species. And for more information on that as well, the Cornell Cooperative Extension is a really good group to get in touch with. And I also wanted to bring up, in terms of chemical methods, some people that really aren't interested in using chemicals, but still want to have that sort of like quick and easy route. There's a lot of things on the internet sort of pushing the option of using like Epsom salt and vinegar and soap. And I knew one lady that sprayed Rust-Oleum paint on her shrubs. So those are also, that's just as bad as using a chemical against what the label states. So in addition to just not working. So if you don't want to get to that point where you're cutting or yanking or pulling or spraying, prevention is always the way to go. Obviously, it doesn't seem super effective when you're already looking at a yard full of barberry, but you can prevent the next thing, is what I always try to keep in mind. So the biggest thing is to be aware of where you source your soil. So that can be just buying some mulch somewhere, putting in new topsoil. You know, you get a plant from your neighbor and they have a bunch of mugwort on their property, and all of a sudden you have mugwort growing around in the plant. Seeds can definitely stay in fill. So that's an important thing to consider. And that could just be as easy as when you show up at the garden center, ask around, oh, do you have a problem with invasives? Or, you know, if you're about to get a truck full of topsoil and you see a bunch of really rapidly growing shrubby stuff, weeds growing nearby, then you might want to think twice about it. And if not in the fill, then just really thinking about the species that you're buying, because very few invasive species have regulations on them, which we'll talk about later. But a lot of invasives are pretty easy to even accidentally purchase. In my years working at garden centers, I've actually informed some customers, oh, actually that's invasive. And then once I tell them, it turns out that that's not really what they wanted for their garden. So it's just a good thing to stay informed and to always keep a close eye on disturbance sites. So if you're, you know, building a new shed out back and you're moving a ton of soil around, you might see some undesirables pop up. So just in terms of, like I mentioned, that you might not want to buy an invasive plant, you just want something that looks nice. This is something that I refer to a lot. It was from the New York's Invasive Species Program. It was called PlantWise New York. It was a little pamphlet that just offered a bunch of alternatives for invasives. So things that look really similar and serve really similar purposes and often are still really easy to grow. So like Norway maple is a really good one. There's a ton of different types of maple, but Norway maple happens to be the invasive one. So go for something that's deciduous and sort of similar. Or sweet autumn clematis is invasive and spreads everywhere. Virgin's bower or native clematis is better for the ecosystem and has like a very similar effect. You can see they're almost identical. And I'm going to talk a little bit about grasses too, but a lot of these are just no-brainers. A yellow flag iris is invasive, but a blue flag iris is extremely similar. Burning bush versus high bush blueberry. So you just, as a gardener, you just have options, because you know your design doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's still a part of the environment. So you can really support birds and wildlife based on your choices. I don't know how similar bamboo is to white spruce though. So if you like bamboo, you might have to just get some artificials. So there's a few other species that I didn't go over because they were neither woodies nor were they ground cover. So this is good. If you join this call, then you probably already hate this plant. Japanese knotweed, very similar to bamboo. These are sort of covering roadsides and creeks and everybody's backyard. And that's because, before I really go into this, the main reason why knotweed is so vicious is because it reproduces by fragmentation. So when knotweed grows along a road, then you might have whoever maintains the road come through and regularly mow the sides of the road. Well, that spreads 1,000 little tiny bits of knotweed segments, and each of those can become a new plant. So that's what reproducing by fragmentation is. And that's why these plants are so successful, because anytime a piece breaks off, it just clones itself. So it's really good at spreading. And that's why it's really hard to get rid of. So that's why I say your first step for knotweed, if you really decide you want to deal with it, is if it's large and established, then you might not want to invest the time in cutting and cutting and cutting, especially because that's not the way to go, which we'll talk about. One thing that does work for small infestations, because it evidently the only time that you really have a good shot at getting rid of knotweed is when it's still small, is to cover it with weed fabric in early spring when it's just starting to come up. And then as it comes up, cover it more, or treat those little stems with herbicide. Stem injection of herbicide injection works really well, but I have to say I did a very small patch for a job once, and it took a really long time, and the injector was difficult to get a hold of. So that's super intensive. Folding is an option if you have a small infestation. So you can fold the stems over below the first node, so it grows a little bit like bamboo. So you have these different segments. So within the first segment, you fold it over every 2 weeks, and it'll go. And it'll sort of shade itself out as it tries to send nutrients and carbohydrates up to the stem. It'll just sort of tire itself out if you keep folding it down. So that has varied success. And then I bring up that it's always good to just reassess and make sure, because I've talked to so many people that get discouraged about invasives management in general because they had a patch of knotweed that they just couldn't beat. It's a really hard plant to beat. So contacting a professional is on there. You can find pesticide technicians that are registered in the state online, or landscaping companies that can try their hand at it. But it is a pretty brutal plant. However, there has been a little bit of talk in the invasives community about putting chicken wire over knotweed that I learned about pretty recently. And apparently if the mesh is small enough, it might have the ability to sort of choke out the stem as it grows through. So that I have not yet tried that, but if you're really desperate and you have some chicken wire laying around, I would be interested to see the results. So I think it sounds like people are going to start doing it. But knotweed removal strategies to avoid, as I've mentioned, don't burn yourself out, cutting, mowing. Sometimes you can dig it up if it's very small, but you literally have to get every single tiny little piece, because every piece can become a new plant, like I mentioned. Foliar spraying or spraying pesticides on the leaves, I typically don't think is super effective, because it becomes so large and out of hand that it can sort of become what my old coworkers used to call a herbicide tornado, and that's not really safe or efficient. And fencing is another one that I've heard people try to implement, just putting a fence at the end of where the knotweed is, but it can just travel beneath the fence. I even know somebody that put in, I think, sheet metal like 4 feet into the ground, and it still moved underneath. So it's not really guaranteed, but definitely cutting and mowing is guaranteed to make it worse. Similar to that, I know somebody had a question about Ailanthus, tree of heaven. This is one that I have a personal vendetta with a little bit. I call it an alien plant. It's pretty scary. So the steps you're going to want to take if you have tree of heaven on your property are to assess and check and make sure that it is tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is really common, but it looks really similar to staghorn sumac. And if your infestation is big, then and your trees are mature, because they can get pretty big, which a lot of people might not notice because they don't branch out until the very top, so you don't really get the chance to ID the leaves or anything. If your infestation is big like that, then you're going to want to talk to somebody about it that is a professional with pesticides. And another thing too is reporting tree of heaven on IMAP, which is invasive species app, and I can send out some materials about it later if you haven't heard of it. The Department of Agriculture and Markets is trying to get a lot of data on tree of heaven right now, because there's another pest called Spotted Lanternfly, if you've heard of that crazy bug, that really likes to feed on tree of heaven. So New York State is looking for as much data on this plant as they can. So I'll send out some additional information about that. But if you like citizen science sort of opportunities and you know where some tree of heaven is, then that could be really cool. And I added a little photo of staghorn sumac as well, so you can see the difference here. Sumac has those beautiful little cones when it blooms. So that's very different, but if those aren't present, then you can kind of see the similarity in the leaves. And the thing to look out for with tree of heaven is, I don't know if you can see, I should have added a better picture, but these leaflets have a little bump at the base. It's called a tear thumb shape, and a smooth edge beyond that. Staghorn sumac has a serrated edge the whole way, so it's not smooth. This is perfectly smooth besides that little bump at the beginning. When it's in seed, when the female trees are in seed, they have these gross little like pink, yellow, alien looking seed pods. But another really good way to check is if you brush up against a tree of heaven, if you scrunch a leaf, if you break a branch, it will smell so bad that you'll say, oh my gosh, what plant is that? And then you'll remember this conversation and say, oh, that's tree of heaven. It's something like, I always think it's sort of like burnt popcorn and skunk. Not great. So the takeaway with this, I mentioned you don't want to cut or mow knotweed. This is one you super don't want to cut without treating. And the reason why is because similar to a hydra or any other alien nightmare species of your choice, when you cut it, then it sort of, for lack of a better term, senses that, and it sends out a hormone into the root stock that spurs it on to send out more of itself, more root suckers, and that can be within a 50-foot radius of the original plant. So say you have a big mother plant and it's really getting on your nerves and you just cut it down, that'll send a ton of that sort of alarm hormone into the roots, and it'll grow back faster and more. So anytime that we treat tree of heaven, we do a method called frilling or hack and squirt. I prefer to say frilling because hack and squirt sounds pretty disgusting. And that's just what it sounds like. Putting little incisions along the bark with a little hatchet, and then spraying herbicide right into the cut. So you don't want to fully girdle the tree. It's actually even more effective if you leave a few inches so that it still passes some xylem and phloem through the plant. So it's still sort of following through with its feeding cycle and uptaking the chemical really well. But with this, just like we saw in the cut stump treatments of the cambiums of woody species, you don't use a lot of herbicide doing this, and it stays right on that plant. And then it can send it out to the roots, to all its little root sucker friends. Other ways that it reproduces are those seeds that I saw. So some people say, well, oh no, I pull out Tree of Heaven all the time. It's super easy. Well, the seedlings you can, but those root suckers, you better have the energy to pull out an entire tree because they're usually all connected. So now I'm going to get into some of the questions. Somebody did have a question about Tree of Heaven, but I wanted to talk about that anyway. Some of the more specific questions that we had that Jen sent over were about Asian jumping worms was one of them. And then I have a few more that I'm going to cover. Asian jumping worms, I was telling Jen earlier, are one of my least favorite species to talk about, because how in the world are you supposed to control a worm? And it's, you know, it's under the dirt. You can't dig up every worm. So it's the management right now is a little dicey, and there's a lot of research going on what we can do to control Asian jumping worms. But the thing to look for just to identify them, which is the easy part, is that first of all, they're going to be really, really buff. They're really, really muscular, and they'll thrash around and be just much more active than a night crawler that you would find normally. They tend to be really plentiful and sort of shallow in the soil. And they tend to have sort of like an oily sheen on them. But really just based on the behavior, you'll almost know when you see one, because it'll be thrashing back and forth and just seeming really unnatural. But if you're not sold, then it also has this little band on it that worms have called a clitellum. On night crawlers, and they're actually, a lot of our worms are European species, but they're naturalized here. They have a sort of a reddish sort of saddle shape clitellum that doesn't fully encircle the body of the worm, whereas with the Asian jumping worms, it will fully wrap around it, and it'll be sort of a milky white to a gray color. The problem with jumping worms is that they process soil really quickly. So instead of just sort of providing nutrients like we learn about it, you know, when we start gardening, it'll just really cycle through it very quickly until the soil is really fine and looks like coffee grounds. So by doing that, it sort of depletes wildlife, like I said, from the bottom up. So by changing the soil, it changes the chemistry of the soil, the nutrients in the environment, and it increases erosion because it's a lot easier to wash away. And it spreads super rapidly, so it can reproduce asexually, and it does that actually with this little thing. That's where the little gross baby worms come out of. So they're a lot more plentiful as well. You'll find a lot at one time. Some of them, like I said, the management on this is sort of in the research phases now, but I did read that you can check for them by mixing some ground yellow mustard with a gallon of water, and the worms will come to the surface, and you can pick them up and get rid of them. So that's a thing that's going around the gardening community. I haven't tried it. I also think that you'd be committing to removing an awful lot of worms by hand, or just doing this ritually, and your neighbors might think you're very strange for pouring mustard into your garden. I don't know. It's not supposed to harm plants, but it, by and large, this species is just really difficult to manage. So that was interesting enough that I put it there, but I don't know if I recommend it. A lot of people heat treat their soil, so they just get soil from store in bags or soil that they want to put in their garden. They just wrap it in plastic for a long time to leave out in the sun because it can kill off the cocoons that come out of that band I mentioned. And the best thing to do really on the prevention front is to just ask when you're at the garden center, do you guys know about jumping worms? Because a lot of people will either say, oh yeah, I did see a few, or like, oh no, we don't, but you should be careful about, because this is a really big issue. And I know a lot of gardeners that used to share plants with their neighbors and things like that, but they don't anymore because they found out that they have these worms. A lot of these worms come from fishing bait. So if you happen to be a fisherman or know a fisherman, just let them know to not dump their worms when they're done, because it might not be clear if they're this kind of worm or not. So that's the lowdown on jumping worms. I hope it wasn't too depressing for all of you, because they're really tough to grapple with. Another question that we got was on, I believe the wording was like on the Facebook group, those like big fluffy grasses. So I inferred that it was about Chinese silvergrass, because it usually is. This is Miscanthus is the Latin. So I brought up earlier that a lot of invasive plants are not limited or restricted very much in terms of what's available to buy. So this is one that is on a restricted list, but the meaning of restricted is that it has a label that says that it's invasive, and it is still for sale. A lot of them will be sterile, but it's sort of difficult to predict the efficacy of a sort of a genetic sterilization in an individual plant. So that's not always guaranteed. It's not a plant that will support birds or wildlife at all. It's not really that great for soil. Pretty much the only thing that it does is look pretty neat. And that's why, as a best management practice, I always just suggest don't plant it if you haven't already, because there's a lot of other cool grasses out there, especially panicum or switchgrass, which I have a photo of as well. And just keeping your neighbors informed about this one and all the others that we've talked about tonight, because a lot of them have just been really trendy plants over the past few generations. So this is definitely one that's just everywhere, so you don't even give it a second thought. This is a panicum species, a switchgrass, and I always think that these are actually prettier. But they're really similar. They have really similar growing requirements, and they sort of have a similar aesthetic effect. So there's not always a need to stick to your guns with the invasives, and a lot of people don't once they know. This one was from a photo that somebody sent in, because they asked about, what is that plant with the giant leaves? So my best guess at this, I'm pretty sure I'm right about it, is that it's northern Catalpa. And so this one's not really terrible for the environment, but it is non-native, so it's not, like we've been talking about, it's not helpful. It doesn't really give back to wildlife. It's brittle, so that's sort of a good thing to know, that if you have this giant tree, because they get really huge, the branches are prone to breaking under severe weather conditions. So it's not something that you want to have near buildings, power lines, or septic systems, because it just spreads out so much, and then it's not it doesn't really hold its ground. A lot of people don't love it because it drops seeds like crazy. It drops flowers, so it'll just have a layer of litter beneath the tree. I at one point worked somewhere that had a giant, beautiful catalpa over the whole garden center, and my job was to just sweep away the seed pods pretty much every 3 hours because it was dropping them so crazy in the summer. But it's been here for a long time. It was brought over with European settlers, so it's still invasive, but it's definitely around. And that's a picture of some of those crazy long seeds that then they dry out and they turn brown, and the those are the seed pods, and the seeds within them are these sort of thin, easily driftable on the wind, sort of flat seeds. So that was cool that somebody sent in a picture though. It also reminded me of a plant called Paulonia or princess tree, which is invasive, which has super big leaves, but it looks pretty different. So I can add that in the notes that we're going to send out later too. So I get really excited when I talk about invasive species. So I might have just rambled on real quick about all of those. But now you guys can feel free to ask any questions. I really like talking about this kind of stuff because it's just something that everybody should have access to knowing about if you're a plant lover, if you just care about what's on your property. So yeah, it was really fun talking to you guys. I can't wait to hear your questions if you have them.
Thank you, JJ. I'm going to pause the recording so folks can turn off their